Come on. Show me something real.
What's up, guys? Editor Clegg here, coming in after the new bomb-ass intro, wearing the same shirt like a week something later. This episode on mid-range is going to be extremely theory-dense. So for entertainment purposes, it probably won't be so entertaining. However, I guarantee you, if you want to increase your performance playing mid-range in the meta in a new era, this is the video that you need to watch. These are the items that you need to consider. Now to the show.
Hello and welcome to cPDH.vibes. I am your host, BeachBotGod69, also known as Adam, with our co-host, Ben, aka South Lakes Vibes, and special guest dancing for us, dancing queen, Clay. Great to have you.
Completely naked, frighteningly naked from the waist down.
And we're coming to you in video today.
Yeah.
So hello.
Hello. How are
you
you?
might have noticed we might have been filmed on the same day we did the last one, but if you were being cynical.
How about
that? So this is the follow-up episode we're looking to do from the two-part series thing, where one of them was supposed to be kind of the voiceover for a gameplay and I played, which was kind of an idea about mid-range decks in the contemporary and like how to play a mid-range deck against combo decks, etc. And then the previous episode we did, which was a bit more of a historical flyby over some decks that have been performant, and a very brief note on some decks that maybe haven't been so performant, and some brief ideas about what we think people have done well or poorly in the past regarding mid-range decks and why the archetype has not seemed to be so performant. But in this episode, what we're going to do is have kind of a very loose, friendly conversation about what we think that people should be doing when brewing mid-range decks based on our own experience, and try to formalize it in a way, maybe look at a couple of examples of our own lists of where we think they did well or poorly and what we would change about them going forward.
And we're experts, so you should listen to us.
Yeah, you're looking at a full-time tournament attendee, so you're dealing with a big cheese here. Okay, so Adam, do you want to kick us off with just Adam? Let's preface this for a sec. So Clay's played everything under the sun, and in the time that Adam and I have been here, I've played a variety of different decks. A lot of them have been mid-range decks. But Adam, since you joined the format on account of time pressures and your own preferences, there's really been one deck that you've played more than anything else, and it is a mid-range deck. So do you want to talk briefly about your experiences with that deck and your feelings on mid-range as a whole, the perception of mid-range, what you think the big things people need to be doing when brewing mid-range decks are? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah. So I've played Mystic Enforcer. It was something that at the time when I first built it, I thought that it was going to be an anti-meta build to beat it was a very combo, like creature-centric, often commander-centric, combo-heavy meta, and I wanted to beat that. And the way that I saw myself beating that, and the way that I like to play, is to have as little in the deck dedicated to the win, and as much dedicated to stopping theirs, so that way I could beat them. And so
for context, before we go any further, so Mystic Enforcer, for anyone who doesn't know at this point, is a 4-mana Selesnya creature. It's a 3/3, which has protection from black. And then if you have Threshold, if you have 7 more cards in your graveyard, it gets +3/+3, becoming a 6/6. That's flying as well.
That's right. And so I built it in a way that would, I saw that the easiest path to victory with this strategy was to have something that was difficult to interact with, and that had the ability to hit quickly. And through a lot of painful trial and error and a lot of criticism, I was build Bliss into what it is now. And the whole point of how I made this deck is that it has flexibility to adjust to the meta and just to the pot. And so that's part of why I've also been piloting it, solely because it's been a constant change in response to the meta. And so it allows me to have the most in the 99 to adjust to what I'm seeing. And I think that though I wouldn't label it mid-range, it tends to pilot that way. Because in my mind, mid-range and what it's trying to be in its identity is the ability to pivot from one strategy to the next, whether I'm going to lean in proactively and apply pressure to my opponent, or find a way to respond to what my opponent's doing. And the ability to pivot, I think, is the success rate of mid-range. And it puts so much pressure on the pilot. It puts a ton of pressure on the pilot. And the more
I feel that maybe there's somehow more skill expression in piloting mid-range decks successfully than other archetypes, or there's more of a decision space which can lead to some paralysis. Or
yeah, and I'm going to actually talk about this. So there's going to be an article coming out on what that was promised in the Stages of the Game theory series that I did, but it's on negotiation within the pod. Thank you. Yeah, it was fun. It was good to do. But negotiation in the terms of, I feel like mid-range is designed to negotiate with the pod. And when I use the word negotiate, it's using tactics to apply pressure or to remove pressures. And whether you're doing game actions or non-game actions, the pressure is on the pilot. Mid-range is designed to be a versatile tool for pilots, is how I see it. And when you build a mid-range deck, the future of mid-range, I think, is going to empower pilots to have versatility, flexibility. And how do you translate that into a win with mostly commons? That's the tough part.
So give me a breakdown. Do you feel that your current list for that deck reflects a template very loosely that you'd advocate most people would use when building mid-range decks? Do you feel that you found ratios that you're happy with? Do you find that you have an identity that you're happy with? How do you feel about the list as it stands today?
It's really interesting that you asked that question, because I started doing that. And this is completely new to both Clay and Ben. I haven't mentioned this yet, but yes. I noticed that a third of the deck pays for the rest of the deck. A fourth of the deck provides access to lands. A third of the deck interferes with my opponent. A third of the deck gets a card for me, or thins the deck. And 1/5 of the deck advances my win directly.
1/5 of the deck. So when you say advances your win directly, what are you running to facilitate that? Are we talking all the glitters? Are we talking pump spells? What are we doing?
So I don't run all the glitters. I don't run the what you would think is traditional. I've been criticized for that a lot. I've just decided that I'm not going to one-shot people. I'm going to two-shot them. And so that's also part of why I haven't deviated from Mystic Enforcer, using this as an example, because Mystic Enforcer, when he's online, only needs +2 power to get 2 and 8 damage. And so 16 damage in Pauper Commander is a 2-shot. So by minimizing the amount of resource required for that 2-shot, I've just committed to the 2-shot is how I have built it at the time of this video. Could change later on.
Fantastic. Sorry, someone's messaging me. I'm trying to avoid them telling me that they love me and they've always loved me without that being on camera for everyone to see. So very silly. I love you.
Stop typing too.
Okay, so the reason I think this is interesting is because obviously you picked up the deck because you thought it looked interesting, but you stuck with it for a protracted period of time. And there must have been a point, there could have been a point, where you thought this just isn't working, etc. But you actually had certainly more success than I would. I'd be silly, but I think certainly you had more success than I expected, and a lot more expected than a lot of other people expected. And I think part of what you've said about wanting to two-shot people rather than one-shot people is kind of integral to how you're feeling on mid-range at large. Because I think we've said before on the podcast that you're quite a defensive player, but you are a big believer in leaving a small footprint until it's too late, or a collection of small footprints rather than one big footprint. So do you feel that should be applied to mid-range decks at large, i.e. they should veer defensively for the most part? Or do you just think that in this particular case, that's what you found to be effective?
And grateful for our guest, Clay, coming here. I'm very interested in his perspective on this question too, but I'll be sure to answer it. You're not going to like this answer. It depends on the pod. And I think that ultimately, I talk a little bit about it in Stages of the Game about noise and your presence. Understanding your role in the pod is also important. That's going to be coming in the next article about not only threat assessment, but role assessment. What's my job here? How does my job pertain to the rest of the pod? So if I'm...
Yeah, you're right. I hate that answer.
Yep. And so I knew it.
I shall wait for a better answer.
But the two-shot thing is, at the time of this video,
No,
is a clear weakness of Mystic Enforcer because, oh, I got another turn.
no.
So to your
Do you think
point,
that you
that's
should
something to think about.
use maybe the inability to put your foot in the gas on account of a very constructive deck build, whilst that might afford you a lot of success in certain situations, has cost you games, and you recognize that occasionally it costs you games.
Yeah, every deck has a weakness. How do you exploit it? How do you negotiate towards it?
Clay, what were you going to say?
Well, I think this also exemplifies. In the last episode, I made it a point to point out specifically the play preferences and styles between myself and Adam, because that factors heavily in the game plan formulated for progressing through a match using a mid-range deck. And Adam's very much on brand with his, well, it's pod dependent. Like, am I getting pressure from this person? Do I have answers for that particular strategy? If I don't have answers for that particular strategy, how do I circumvent or otherwise mitigate that risk? Like, he's very much thinking about, I forget which one is which. I think I'm yin, he's yang, if I recall that correctly. But he's very much reacting to what he's, experiencing in the pod, which from my perspective is a brutal way to try to build your deck, because you have to think about all of the circumstances in advance that you're going to find yourself in and provide some sort of way to interact with those circumstances meaningfully. Conversely, I'm very much, and this will come up. We'll talk about Corpse Knight more specifically in a later video where I'm going to do like a deck tech based off of these future recommended premises by which we should be approaching mid-range. But like, I very much want to, it's like, I think of it like mid-range should be chopping at a tree. You take a small chunk, and then you take a larger chunk, and then eventually you've taken a succession of larger chunks, and the tree falls over. And that's very much to paint a picture, my perspective on how you should be approaching, waiting for the tree to fall. Sorry, Adam. It doesn't make much sense to me. Is the wind blowing? I'm very much like, let's go after him, go get him. And once again, I'm not suggesting that my proactive approach is better than his reactive approach. It's just a matter of pointing out that there's differing perspectives and approaches.
I think that those approaches are, it's not that neither approach, first of all, it's important to recognize that there is a limit to talking abstractly about things, right? At some point you have to give case studies and examples of how you play in a given situation. But if we assume that what you've said is worth exploring then for both of you, I don't think it's the case that either of those things is wrong or correct. I think it's just they're both based on different underlying assumptions about what games are going to look like, what people are going to be doing in games. The Adam's approach, if you take it on the premise that Adam prefers not to attack if he gives the opportunity to see how the game progresses, or he'd like to do a small amount of damage to avoid invoking the ire of someone, that's on the premise that person can deal lethal damage to him, or their attention on him would be significantly deleterious. Whereas I think, Clay, your perspective is that whether that's true or not, you have to make things happen in the game. And whereas Adam, I think, is hoping that things people generally wear each other down, almost irrespective of what the pod looks like. They gradually lose resources, they gradually get lower, and at which point the person's been sitting quietly can capitalize on that. I think your view, Clay, is that sometimes you have to make that happen. You have to be the change you want to see in the world in order to make that happen in the first place. And there is an aspect of just that both of those things can be true depending on what you're piloting. And certainly the ability to suddenly go, you're dead in 2 turns, like kill you once, twice. You haven't got the time to refine the answer. You are explicitly dead. I'm not interested in politicking. If you've otherwise been quiet, could be effective. But as Adam's already pointed out, sometimes that just isn't going to be enough. And you might want to just be able to one-tap that player. And what you effectively end up at the same conclusion. It's just that, Clay, you are trying to create the circumstance where you have the freedom to one-tap that player and remove them. You just set up the initial damage, accepting this risk that Adam is maybe more reluctant to accept, that if you keep poking them, they're going to start looking at you, and then you might suffer some ill consequence.
I'd like to add a very specific and critical point to this. I feel in many spaces, cPDH spaces online and, throughout the globe, that certain players have the proclivity to look at either my perspective or Adam's perspective and say, oh, that one over there is right, that one over there is wrong. No, we both have value in our perspectives. He's obviously, I'm pointing in this direction. This guy has obviously got an outstanding win rate, 31% with his Mystic Enforcer list. Like, he can stand on the merits of his own ideas legitimately. It's just a matter of, like, are you my type of player or are you more his type of player? If you're his type of player, that doesn't make my idea shit. It just means that you lean more into the advantages that he's trying to orchestrate in his deck construction, and you're going to find little success in doing what I'm doing because it's going to be uncomfortable. But and vice versa.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Whereby if you endorse opinion A and the other person endorses opinion B, but if person A sets up a deck and plays in a manner that realizes outcome A, they're going to show that outcome A could be more effective, etc., on account of attempting to achieve that. But yeah, there is a risk of being a bit too hand wavy, kind of, oh, anything's valid, do whatever the fuck you want. And it's like, well, actually, no, at some point you need to start realizing under what conditions you might be winning these games, etc. Yes. But conversely, there's also the aspect of being like, this has been the way I've known it for 5 years. This is the only way to play Magic. I refuse to see any other opinion. And then eventually you realize you were wrong, but you were a year too late and your tournament results suffered as a result, etc. So I think being open-ended to what people are saying is good. But I also think that, again, particularly in the context of mid-range, it is really interesting trying to unpick the thesis that someone puts forward and look at what the underlying assumptions are about what the games are going to look like, etc. So, yeah. So what should we do now? Should we have a quick look?
You asked me. Absolutely, we can dive into your slides. I did want to point out that it occurred to me, and I haven't had the opportunity to communicate this to you, so I'm having to do so by virtue of the video. You wanted me to talk about my Sir Conrad list.
Yes, please.
So what's interesting about Conrad is that it started out, I shit you not, as the premier aggro list for the format when the average number of turns were like 14 per game. Now, as things progressed on and more mid-range research started to happen, there was some mid-range focus on Sir Conrad, which ultimately, through its discovery and brewing and what have you, ended up being what I am calling a control list, which is the point of contention that we're going to talk about later. But I wanted to bring that up as a historical fact, so that way when we get to that point.
It's all contextual, right? These labels are completely contextual. If you say that mid-range decks aren't aggro, and by extension aggro means converting on a certain turn, if that certain turn the aggro has to convert in moves, and by definition all these old discussions move around, etc. And so again, it's like semantics of this are only as valuable as what you extract out of them. And if the lessons don't change, it doesn't really matter what words we use to describe any of this. So
yeah, 100%.
Adam, before I jump into my opinion on brewing mid-range decks, etc., did you want to talk more broadly about your thesis on all of this and how you feel about mid-range decks, no matter why they might be slightly underperforming, what you'd advocate people would do?
Yeah, I think overall, and some of it is already written and posted on cPDH.guide in the articles section, and there will be more content there to read, and hopefully it's helpful to other people. But my take is that if you're in a situation where you have multiple frenemies, if you got opponents that could also be allies, and you gotta play that, then I go to Sun Tzu, Machiavelli, and Otto von Bismarck and what they have to say about it.
Famously, all of whom very avid Magic players, so
yeah,
they should. I mean, look, you're wargaming in a pod just with guardrails on, and so being able to figure out how to negotiate with these friends who are also threats and have different situations, having the tools to respond and react is important. And I use the word react, and I feel like I wear the scarlet letter of reactive. But my favorite step is the combat step. If I'm negotiating with somebody, I don't mind using the stick, and it's fun to use. Wow. So I'll tell you, it's going to come down to how do I get what I want without inviting more damage to myself. And so that's very asymmetrical thought.
If I can summarize then what I understand of your perspective, the general thesis, I've known you for now almost 2 years, and your general premise is you want to have as much creative expression in a pod that has fruitful outcome as possible. You're a lot less interested in trying to set up some means of consistently winning a game by a certain time, etc. You're a lot more interested in having meaningful levers you can pull in different situations that give you a better chance of winning the game. By extension, you're quite interested in what other people are doing and how you can use that to your advantage.
Absolutely. My favorite card, my first card that I have to justify not using is Glasses of Urza. I want to know what's in your hand.
Yeah, it's a great card, by the way. Big shout out to Glasses of Urza. I really wish we got more cards like Glasses of Urza. That's so cool.
Yep.
Okay, let me go ahead. So I wasn't going to share my screen. I'm hoping we can bring this up sort of somewhat clunkily on the podcast episode on YouTube. So I yesterday sat down and tried to think about how I wanted to frame my thoughts on mid-range more generally, and actually how different they were to my thoughts on basically everything else that you could be brewing in meta. And I decided the best way to do this was to think about what I care about at the highest possible level and work my way down into the nitty-gritty, etc. So if I go ahead and bring my screens, my fantastic PowerPoint presentation, I'm going to call Tiers of Giving a Shit. So we work our way down the tiers, and this is how much you individually give a shit about any of the individual points. Well, we will begin. Am I sorry about what?
Are you presenting it?
I'm just going to layer on over the end, Adam. So before we talk about mid-range, we have to have some definition of mid-range in order for me to formulate my thoughts around it. And again, it does differ a little bit from Clay's and Adam's, but basically, as I've said before, I think mid-range is basically neither aggro, tempo, control, or combo. It typically tends to present some kind of value proposition and hopes to use it to present lethal advantage at some point in the game, typically around the average win turn. So there's there's components of how you build a deck, but there's also components of some abstract sense of clock. So we will start with the highest tier of what I think people should care about when brewing their deck. This is the most fundamental thing you are supposed to care about, which is, can you win the game consistently inside 90 minutes if you're left alone and in a real pod environment where other people are trying to win? You want to be able to figure out, can this deck actually deal enough damage, Voltron or literal damage, or mail everybody out, or whatever other win condition you establish inside 90 minutes, and you want to prevent other people from doing so in that time. And the longer you take to do so, the more effort you have to spend on stopping other people from winning. That's the highest level goal. And whenever you're brewing a deck and you're wondering about those last couple of cuts, in my view, you go back to this top level goal and think about, this is what I'm trying to do. We walk down a layer of abstraction for a second. It's kind of parroting what's the highest level. I want us to split it into 2 points. Your 2 focus points are having a high consistency in affecting your game plan, irrespective of what decks you're playing against and who is piloting them. And you want a high consistency in stopping other people from winning, regardless of what you're playing against and regardless of who is piloting them. Now, you can pull those 2 levers individually and figure out which one is more important to you, and to some extent it's a trial and error, but the best decks in the meta will be very good at both of these things. And this is what you are looking to optimize for. Can you find the damage necessary by whatever turn you deem appropriate? And while you are doing so, can you stop other people from winning the game? We get down into a layer of abstraction beneath that. Look, there's a whole bunch of subjective metrics you can come up with where you try and figure out what you actually care about in games. And I've tried to capture what I think are some of the principal points of consideration and principal metrics you're optimizing for, very subjective, very qualitative, when you're brewing your deck. So if we walk down the list, the first thing is local robustness. So this is your ability to recover from interference from other people inside games. If your commander gets blown out or your board gets wiped, can you recover and get back to a position where you can credibly win the game? Not just durdle along the floor of your deck, but actually climb back to a position of strength. The next one would be meta robustness. If people start playing completely different stuff, does your deck survive? As an example, something like Hollow Marauder, currently very strong because not a lot of graveyard hate. People start running a lot of graveyard hate, the deck radically, in my view, probably radically nosedives in viability. And whilst therefore it may have a very high, for example, local robustness, it might have a low meta robustness. Then there's the floor and the ceiling. So we use these terms floor and ceiling. What we tend to mean is the minimum and maximum performance of X given a certain circumstance. So in this case, a high floor would mean that even if you had horrendous conditions, a terrible opening hand, you're missing land drops, your opponents are doing really well, can your deck maintain a reasonable likelihood of winning the game? And then, of course, there's a high ceiling, which is an interesting point that I think I would criticize Adam's Mystic Enforcer deck for, in spite of having what I consider to be a relatively high floor in his case, which is the ability to capitalize on an unusually advantageous game state. You've got 3 opponents, 2 of them have mulligan to 5 cards, the other guy's missing land drops left and right. What can you do to close the game faster than expected? Gut Leader is a great example of this as well. Having a deck with an exceptionally high floor, where you're able to convert basically any opening hand into something playable. But on account of the fact that you can typically only create 1 skeleton to hit someone with per turn, the ceiling on that deck is questionable. You can't necessarily capitalize on your opponents not doing very much. Then there's obfuscation. What is the quality of your hidden information? So Adam doesn't play all the glitters, for example. And I would argue that whilst he's probably got very good reasons to do so, one of the reasons to play that card in the first place is that there's a radical change in how fast his deck can actually end the game. It goes from, let's say, 6 turns of hitting somebody to 3 turns of hitting somebody. So what have you got in your hand that can completely transform the outcome of the game? Something, of course, combo is the upper limit of this. They outright win the game if they get everything into play, but it doesn't have to be specific to combo. Hare's decks like Corpse Knight, very strong list, lots of damage at the table, and a few pieces of hidden information like the Gruesome Fate that does direct damage equal to the number of creatures you control. But for the most part, actually not using those kind of tools. And so limited amount of obfuscation because it frankly just doesn't care that much about having hidden information. You know they're probably going to play more hares. And the pinnacle point of the deck is that you don't care about that because you're going to hurt everybody anyway. There's the matchup quality. So how consistently do you have good matchups against other meta decks? There's the quality of the win condition, i.e., how good is the mechanism by which you win the game? Can people remove it using silver bullets, fogs, lot hate auras in your commander, etc.? How easily can people prevent you from presenting a threat at the table? And the last point at this level of abstraction I would raise would be justification for this deck over an analog it might have in the meta. Adam's already suggested that he feels that Mystic Enforcer, for all of its strengths, may not be able to justify itself over something like a Wilson Traveler or something like a Satyr Enchanter. And that's not to say that the deck doesn't have unique selling points, because in both those cases it does, but maybe it doesn't do quite enough to justify continual investment. Or maybe it does. But either way, this is the sort of thing you have to be thinking about. Can you justify playing this thing? Is it good at winning the game? And how well can it perform at its worst? And how well can it capitalize at its best? I'm going to dive down another little abstraction here. So now we're getting a little bit more to the nitty-gritty of what you should be putting in your decks and what you care about. The first thing I've put here is resource acquisition premise. So this is basically the means by which you obtain actions to keep taking the game. People typically mean card draw when they see this. How good is your deck at drawing cards? But it doesn't have to be that. You could be exiling cards off the top. You could have actions you can take from the graveyard. You could have a mana sink at the command zone. What capacity do you have to keep acquiring additional advantage across the course of the game? I'm going to try and speed run some of these to avoid boring Adam and Clay to death. But as an additional point of that, we've got synergies between cards in the 99. TPI as an example, exceptional synergy with Galvanic Blast and Thoughtcast, etc. But then also the interaction that deck casts to hurt other people advances its own win condition because it creates 1/1s off the back of it, which you could argue gives it an advantage over something like Balmor, although they're relatively different as Spellslinger decks, because Balmor cannot take advantage of the prowess trigger, the board-wide prowess trigger, off casting spells on opponent's turns. You've got your interaction quality. Adam runs a lot of like auras and graveyard hate, etc. Stuff that's really useful, can be very disruptive. But I would question how generally applicable that actually is. Most problems in life format can be solved by removing a creature. Does your interaction suite, for the most part, if you're running tap down or enchantment removal or artifact removal, does it solve most of the problems you're going to encounter? There's a threat presence across turns. Are you able to threaten people and apply pressures at the combo decks early, or are you relying on waiting to the late stages of the game? And then there's a point here about that I think Adam would really appreciate, which is the political strength of the deck. Like, can you politic effectively with other people at the table? So Tatiova, Gretchen, and Weavers, for all of their strengths, are actually not particularly good at this because a lot of what they run is not necessarily interaction but protection. and they're not interested in winning the game or applying pressure other than just beating everybody at the table. So there's limited political capacity of those decks. It's one of the few weaknesses I think they actually have. Just rattling through these, we've got escalation potential. Again, this kind of comes under obfuscation, but it's a more specific component of that. Do you have pump spells? Do you have direct damage? Can you suddenly deny someone their resources? How can you subvert somebody's expectations for what your deck is going to be doing on turns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc.? Come back to robustness. We've got the defense of the game plan against unusual hostility. We've all sat down at a table and somebody has said, yep, your deck is the problem. We're going to throw everything at you. Almost no deck can survive this, but can you survive long enough for the mood at the game at the table to change? What level of hostility can you tolerate for how long? And can you politic effectively enough to subvert that hostility and maintain a position at the table? And the last point here would be the lack of silver bullet weaknesses. Polymer Order, phenomenal deck, does not like Graveyard Hate. Alexios, very scary. The deck is effectively completely removed from the game if someone manages to resolve an oubliette. So have you built your deck in such a way that if someone can resolve one of these not entirely uncommon one-off cards, the deck can still maintain a likelihood of winning the game? So, boys, do we want to take a breather here, or are you happy for me to run through the categories in D?
Yeah, go ahead, dude. Go ahead, do
let's
D.
finish it. I'm going to try and do this in 2 minutes. I'm going to get it done. Okay, so D is the lowest level of abstraction. And this is really just a series of questions that I think people should be trying to answer when they are building their decks. So here we go. Do you draw cards or otherwise obtain resources consistently and without hurting your momentum? Do you typically have at least one piece of single target creature removal by turn 5, or otherwise a means of stopping yourself from losing the game? Can you end the game in a vacuum by turn 10 to 8 to 10? If not, are you confident of being able to see and resolve enough disruption to stretch your opponent's clocks? Moving into the more control side of things. Can you gain life and prevent lethal commander damage while still advancing your game plan adequately? Can you focus down a single player or players if needed? Can you prevent a player suffering by your actions and therefore politic with them effectively? Is your threat comparable or better to the other decks present in the meta? And is it aiming to win around the same turn? Can you recover from losing your hand early or having a really bad opening mulligan? Can the deck credibly find wins without the commander? And if not, can you cast the commander 3 times? Do you have credible plans to beat severely bad matchups? And do you have serviceable matchups into what you consider to be the best top 10 decks in the meta? Is the deck able to consistently present or resolve whatever justification it has over its analogs? If Mystic Enforcer is to justify itself over Satyr Enchanter, is the fly and the protection from black relevant enough to make that justification valid? And finally, do you have more than one means of credibly ending the game? And that is not essential, but in most cases, the best decks we have in the meta can end the game through multiple means. So that was about 10 minutes. That was a lot of stuff. I'll try and make these slides available, but please jump in.
I'll copy these slides. Yeah, I'll copy these slides and put them in a link that's accessible in the description. Because it is a lot of information, but the reason why I think Ben's points here are critical is because it's meant to get you thinking about various components and aspects of your deck. One of my dogs. So it's meant to get you thinking about your deck in very critical ways. So most people. That's unfair. I was going to say most people just think about mid-range from the perspective of 2 vectors, and that's resource advantage and beat sticks and the application of both, and that's an oversimplification. And I think what you do with your premises here is help people kind of evaluate certain segments of their deck construction to ensure that, if I have overlap here and overlap here and overlap here, then theoretically I'm increasing my my win rate chances. So I think that's extremely valuable. We all recognize that it's a little dry in the explanation of things. Yes, but it needs to be.
These questions aren't sexy, and there's a problem I think sometimes where people will build something in a way that they think looks cool or they run cards because they think they're cool, and it's not that those cards aren't cool. It's not that you can't run cool cards. It's that it can often be an excuse to not think about what the deck can actually run into. And ultimately, I think there's enough enjoyment you can have by performing well in a game of Magic without needing to run in cards that you just think are kind of wacky in a competitive environment or have one-off niche uses. I think you should be thinking about the generic case. And if you're not enjoying it after that, then you can start thinking about tooling it up to something you actually enjoy piloting more.
You got to enjoy the deck that you're playing.
For sure.
Really. I mean, the whole, at the end of it all, this is a game, let's have fun. But I find a lot of the fun in some of these competitive elements that we're discussing, and this is actually really helpful. So thank you.
So very telling. So I am the antithesis of that. I don't necessarily have to find fun in what I'm playing. I find fun in the unfun of others.
I guess, well, that's fun. That's
so
fun.
if you're not having fun, I know that I'm doing something successfully, and I'm gonna, exemplify.
Trying to understand why you got 5 from that preschool now,
Clem. Billy Madison, the kids with the
I
dodgeballs.
like watching them suffer.
No, so where along the points would you like to start? So the definition. So my presumed definition of mid-range, as we discussed in the previous episode, or the one recorded 15 minutes before this one, it would be the previous episode. So I don't necessarily disagree with your neither aggro, neither tempo, neither combo, neither control. I've kind of placed it in this. Mine's more of a tempo-oriented definition by which, those decks typically win. So,
100%. Yeah.
Which is not. It's not adding or subtracting from yours. In fact, if we kind of sandwich ours together, it seems to probably provide more clarity on the thing as a whole. So,
I think what you've described is kind of more functionally tempo, whereas I'd say that tempo shells tend to look kind of specific. Tempo decks tend to be a lot more comfortable running sorcery to removal.
Yeah, when I
they tend
say
to be a lot more interested in removing a creature, whereas I think mid-range decks can pilot like tempo decks, but you're still running the big splashy spells.
Yeah.
You're still running the gotchas that maybe tempo decks aren't as interested in strictly.
Yeah, I'm not talking tempo, the archetype or strategy. Sure. I'm talking time. Tempo literally equals time.
Yeah. Understood. Yeah, you want to buy yourself time to enact your game code. You're kind of effectively playing slow aggro, but with more versatility and a trade-off of speed than what we'd call conventional tempo. Sure. I think maybe the most profitable thing we do is we look at the stuff in B. So this is where I kind of laid in these kind of high-level considerations for metrics that we consider good or bad decks by, and looking at maybe some of the decks we talked about last episode, where we talked about Wilson Traveler, etc., and looking at whether or not we think there's maybe any more criteria that should go in here, or whether how we think these decks rank up by these criteria, if it makes sense, if it's useful or not. So, for example, if we look at in B, we've said the robustness, both internally and externally, a high floor and a high ceiling, some quality of hidden information, generically good matchups, a quality win condition, and then a justification for playing the deck over something else in the meta.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other metrics that when you're looking at someone, you're talking to someone, what are you thinking about when you're building a list? That's that level of you're talking with just above the level of card advantage and specific interaction pieces and stuff, but are there metrics you guys are thinking of when you're building your list? So Adam, maybe in your case, it'd be something like the threat you apparently present to people or something to that effect.
Well, from Adam's perspective, I'd like to, because he mentioned earlier, and I'd like to tie two things together. He mentioned earlier his deck composition of, I've got this much of this, this much of this, this much of this, this much of this. And I would love if Adam would kind of, because this, yeah, exactly. This is Ben's proposed premise of how he does his deck construction. Now, it doesn't specifically infer the number of certain pieces, for deck construction. But
it's not a prescriptive ratio. I could come up with one, but yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious to see because Adam represents the actual development of the prescriptive ratio relative to these abstract concepts that aren't listed. So he gave us that. I'm curious to see how those concepts potentially marry up because we're sword fighting, and
Both
Yeah.
good.
So if you can just forgive me, just ask it again so that way I can make sure I'm answering it right.
So what I'm getting was when you look at these criteria in B, Adam, when we're talking about robustness and having a high floor and a high ceiling, etc. Are there any other metrics that you think about, or big questions you ask yourself, things you're trying to optimize for when you're building your lists? Any words that encapsulate what you're looking for, or when you see one list for another, why you think something works or doesn't work? Is there anything that you think is missing, or that you think is you go to straight away and say this deck is good at this, it's good at capitalizing on things other people do, etc.? Is there any other metrics I've missed, or anything you disagree with?
Well, I look for the mechanisms that make deck successful, and then I ask, can my deck destroy that? So just I'm like Clay at the preschool.
Right.
I try. I mean, one thing that I've done successfully in repeatable interactions is like lay lore, being able to get rid of the targeted land at the right time. Like those are strong plays. How do you exploit the weaknesses of your deck of your opponents? How do you mitigate the weaknesses of your own? And so usually, I take it to. I'm going to compare this to football or other sports. I think
remember they're Magic players.
yeah, I know, but I mean that well they actually are. So
Fantasy football.
Cassius Marr, she's a great great Magic player. But if you have a team that has no pass, you are giving 0 yards to your opponent. You are not handing advantages to your opponent. If I build a deck that is balanced enough to eliminate not getting the lands I need, not getting the cards that I need, not beating myself, does my deck beat itself? Is the first thing that I look at. And that's your floor ceiling stuff, but it's also, do I get the things that I need in order to exploit and actually do my game plan? And so I spend a lot of time trying to galvanize the deck. That's one thing that I would say that mid-range needs to do very well, is how do I smooth and galvanize the whatever my deck is trying to do, how do I make sure that I don't get in my own? And
So in that premise, then what we describe as a high floor, which is just the ability to perform in an actual condition, even when things are not going your way, is important to you. But also maybe something that I felt I'd addressed higher up, but probably should be in here, which is just the consistency of being able to play out your play pattern. So being able to hit your commander on a certain curve, etc.
yeah, and for the way for this deck to, if we use Mystic Enforcer as kind of an example here, other decks are going to have different clocks, different strategies. I know that I need to play Mystic Enforcer probably within the mid game in order to win in the late game. And that's just usually how it goes. So otherwise my chances of winning go down because I know that I need to hit. Right. That's just what I've accepted as, and I'm telling everybody's weakness. I probably shouldn't, because now I need to figure out a new deck to play. But that's an example of a weakness in a deck. Right? Exactly. Well, but there's other weaknesses, like, so I will pick on Laylor for a second. Very, very successful, quick combo deck that just outpaces everybody. They're looking to win consistently by the start of the mid game or within the early game before people are established to interact with. And so you have to be able to, do you have removal for the land or the land itself by turn 3, aka in your opening hand, to stop Laylor? If you don't, you lose.
I don't necessarily. It's not the
that.
conclusion I come to on that point, and I think it highlights the difference in the two of us. I think that the strength of Laylor, really, aside from occasionally being fast, is that it's extremely good at grinding in the same way that Gretchen is. I mean, it's just designed to keep vomiting out mana and then converting that into more and more cards. And I think that trying to fight Laylor with interaction is a losing premise. It's also worth noting that if you stop it early, it doesn't mean you stop it again later. I think the real thing we need to do to fight those decks is actually apply more pressure on them. And do the thing that they're not good at, which is defending themselves in combat or getting more life, etc. Go on, Clay.
So, sorry, Adam. So,
No.
as the resident Laylor Weaver player, So I will concur with Ben in the fact that if you thwart Laylor or Gretchen, Simic land decks early, they can win at a later time. However, time. So there's a distinct amount of
Need to get the time.
Yeah, there's a number of turns between the early win attempt and the later win attempt. Now, is that 2 turns, 3 turns? Okay, that's the bit that's unknown. However, what your job is to capitalize on that time that you've created from that early removal of combo pieces or what have you. So go ahead, Adam.
I think this. Sorry, Adam, go on. It was your turn. Go on.
Well, I was just gonna say this is exactly right, and you have to get the time to kill the deck that's faster. And how do you get that time? Now, if you are the fastest deck, how do you do it in a way that's inconspicuous enough to where they don't stop you?
Mm.
And that's really a challenge because usually the fast decks they're already taken, they've already found them, and it's tough to find the new ones. I mean, new sets are coming out every 2 days, so you'll come up with something. Thank you, Hasbro. We're flooded with ideas, right? But that's my take on it, and how that applies to mid range. Back to the main point of the ratios. Don't get in your own way, get in their way. And in order to get in their way, you have to be able to have access to what you need and flexibility of what I need when. So toolbox decks they tend to work well if that's your mentality. Mm-hmm. That's why I tend to gravitate towards them myself. But there's more than one way to do it. There's absolutely more than one way to do it.
And if I may, Adam, be complimentary to your toolboxy idea. So where Mystic Enforcer specifically is concerned, less. I mean, not less. It also extends to other aura-based and Selesnya type lists. So you're using interaction like what's that? Benevolent Blessing, which is an aura-based piece of interaction with flash that can be used to both protect and interrupt, like a Freed from the Real type combo where you're attaching a colored permanent or circumstance to, an opponent is doing that for their creature. So there's this modality that's built into that. The same with Generous Gift, where you can destroy a Weaver's land or Gretchen's land, but also interact with a gut
quality of interaction.
Yeah. So it's like finding these pieces of modality within the pieces that you are choosing or selecting for your particular list. So, and
again, I come back to the same premise, the same point, which is that you need to know what your clock is, because all these conversations come into that. Generous Gift is not a cheap spell. And so although the modality is something you pay for by finding it difficult to hold up on occasion. So if you run that card, there has to be an implication for what the rest of the deck looks like. You're probably a deck that looks to draw a card and then pass a turn. You're a deck that is able to, like Gut, for example, that's able to enact what it wants to do and have most of its mana available at any point in time. Or you're a deck that looks to make a lot of mana. But all these things need to work in context, right?
Adam,
people are giggling at me. I'm
Adam
not sure
is
why I missed.
scolding his wife.
No, the dogs. I'm getting little chihuahuas looking at me over and over. They want my attention. I know.
I was saying that I think on this point, when we talk about making time for the decks, etc., I think you should need to justify every additional turn you give your opponents. If you say there is a profound difference between winning on turn 7 versus winning on turn 9, you are inferring that your opponents will not be able to disrupt you or win the game in those 2 additional turns. That either means you have additional protection / interaction to slow them down in those turns, or that you've previously removed their ability to do so. So it's not acceptable to just say, well, my deck's kind of slow, but I'm sure I'll figure it out. You need to know if you can figure it out, right? You either can or you can't. And other people can't do it for you, but they're not incentivized to do so.
So let's take that to the nth degree. Let's say you're a mid-range deck in a completely fast combo pod. You're in for a rough day from the go. So what you're gonna have to do. So Clay's in that pod. He's making an assessment. I'm gonna pick what I perceive to be the fastest combo deck at the table. Now, seat position's going to play heavily into this as well on who goes.
And the hands they take and the pieces they present, the tutors they use, that kind of stuff.
So I'm going to try to buy time against the fastest person, and this is the social aspect of the game. You're going to have to be talking to those other two combo players and be like, look, I have some interaction against this person. That alleviates you of any responsibility, at least early, of interacting with this person. So that means, you're going to have to be Spider-Man pointing at each other, and, that's how it goes. Now, I gave the nth degree example because as we start to scale back, I mean, you and I were two mid-range decks faced against two combo decks. And I don't think one a fast combo deck, one a middle fast combo deck. I think
they're both pretty fast. I think Goalkeeper and Malcolm Cat are both pretty speedy decks.
I think we handled ourselves pretty well. So as we start to scale back even further, and there's one combo deck at the table, now, I mean, so the point that I'm driving at is the circumstance relative to that initial premise of creating time. I think that is exacerbated by the archetypes that are present at the table. And if it's all combo decks that you're facing, you're screwed. But I mean, maybe not. But
I want to touch this just before you turn to that. There is this in defensive mid-range. There is this thing people do where they're like, oh well, you don't want to be a mid-range deck in an all combo pod. You don't want to be a mid-range deck in an all aggro pod. It's like, do you want to be an aggro deck in an all aggro pod? Do you want to be a combo deck in an all combo pod? Like, what the fuck are we doing? Some of the pods are just like fatalistic, and if there's not a suitable balance, nobody feels in fucking control. Right? There's no more reason that you having a consistent source of pressure that mounts over time is more or less likely to win than you attempting to resolve an infinite loop in an environment where everyone else is trying to resolve an infinite loop. And so again, look, the stats speak for themselves. Midrange is not performing well, but there is this thing people do where they're like, well, it has no good matchups. It's like you can almost any pod where everybody's doing the same thing looks fucking terrible for the format as a whole. Right? It's just a complete coin flip. Who gets it's like second mouse gets the cheese or whatever. Especially with combos and stuff. It's like, oh, brilliant move. You happen to have the bits while the first guy got stopped because he also happened to have the bits. So this is not an endorsement of excellent piloting. It's just chance at some point. Sorry, Adam.
Yeah. At 52 minutes, Adam, get it.
Sorry.
There's an example that's just beautiful piloting of I can't remember which sanctuary it was, but it was the one that Xiao Jun won.
Control.
Shout out to Alcadron.
Shout out to Alcadron. Dave did a beautiful job in this. His first match of that tournament was 3 combo decks in him. He ended up winning. And it was just a masterclass of how to difficult piloting and beautiful execution. And some of that is through the negotiation. I mean, it truly is through the negotiation and using his resources in a way that was sparingly enough to not run out, but also spent well enough to have an impact towards the end of the game. And so that to me is where I get the most fun out of playing a game of Magic in a potted format, is to be able to have that balancing act and to be able to actually guide through it, which is probably why I gravitate to this strategy. But it can be 3 combo decks and 1 mid-range or control list. It can be done, but it is not easy to say the same thing. It's an uncomfortable spot. But knowing where you are, seat position, we talked about this before, seat position and what you're piloting and how that impacts the environment of that pod, they all matter.
Politicking matters. You have to be able to make sure people are on the same page. If you sit in a situation, people are just like, well, he's tutoring, so I'm tutoring. We're all driving the bus off the cliff together. It's like, you either change their minds or you probably lose because people are just lemmings jumping off the cliff.
Politicking matters sometimes.
Politicking matters sometimes, as it turns out.
Sometimes. But also that's another. Ben hates the term 4D chess, but I say it a lot to rub it in his face. So it's in. I refer to 4G chess as 4D chess. Jesus. I refer to
Double
it
D
as
chess. Yeah.
Yes.
Big juicy chest.
That's what I was thinking about as I was saying it. I refer to that as actions that can be independently taken by a player based on assumptions they make about the current game state or perceived future game state. And those actions taken are meant to circumvent the normal actions that are exhibited by and both exhibited and experienced by players, but also are meant to give you a slight advantage at a minimum.
Let's call it strategy. It's such a fucking backslapping expression we use with 4D chess. This is not that big brain.
It makes me feel smart to say it.
Okay, fine. So I don't want to take that away from you, Claire. I know it's been hard since they fired you from that preschool, so I don't want to take that away from you. Right, so we got a few minutes left in the episode. We didn't get around to the comrade conversation. I'm happy to do that, Clay, have a brief discussion about where we feel the control ends and mid-range begins, or we could wrap it up here. It's at your discretion. Talk about whatever you want.
So I think let me see if I can marry these concepts. So the items that you outlined in your PowerPoint seek to try to, now for on your end, you haven't really concerned yourself too much with deck composition, like actual numbers and what have you, but these are all things that you should be thinking about as you're constructing a list. Now, where the Conrad example becomes relevant is because, as we previously identified, these concepts surrounding archetypes can shift as like major factors relative to the meta shift as well. In this case, turn count. So we're talking, in a way, we're talking about time. Not to say that you can't have 14 or 28 turns happen in 90 minutes. So I'm not necessarily talking about the 90 minutes part directly, although it is somewhat implied, because typically 9 to 12 turns happen within the scope of 90 minutes, but often less than 90 minutes. So that turn order, or that amount of turns, isn't necessarily completely expressive of the total amount of time that you have. Anyway, that was a little bit of a tangent. So Conrad started off as, the Conrad Rats version started off as the premier aggro list for cPDH way back when. Now that's when the average game time was 14 turns in a game. So you had plenty of time to deploy your little rats and build up board states and swing and do copious amount of damage with the rats, all capitalizing on them dying by Conrad. So about a year and a half ago, Conrad became the subject of conversation again. I deviated away from the rats version because the amount of time had shifted in the number of turns. So relative to the points on your PowerPoint, those items for consideration are heavily impacted by time.
Of course, so, 100%.
So it moved to more of a, okay, how can I, because Conrad says plainly that any creature that dies that goes to a graveyard deals 1 damage to your opponent.
Doesn't even have to die. Conrad just cares about anything entering a graveyard from anywhere by any mechanism.
Yeah. So die, mill. Well, leaving is relative to the person who owns or controls Conrad.
Okay, sure.
So yeah,
leave your graveyard, sure.
So into graveyards, and my thought process was, how can I exploit and amplify this changing of zones as much as I possibly can? So Conrad at one point in time had, I know we talked horribly about in the previous episode about these value piles Well, we started out as a value pile trying to move things around. We didn't have, not that we didn't have access to a bunch of swamp cyclers back then, but I mean, we've got infinitely more access to infinitely more swamp cyclers. And that's just a one type of value piece that you can change zones from your hand to the graveyard to make Conrad kind of ping the table. So now, using those considerations, I mean, I could probably go through your list and point out several considerations, most of which are relative to, like, how am I impacting my opponents? So whether or not that's floor or ceiling or, you know, what have you, like the impact on the opponents and the changing of zones, you start to consider the efficacy and not efficacy. Well, the efficacy versus efficiency coefficient. Like, okay, I'm able to pay 2 mana to do this 1 damage to 3 opponents. Yeah. Is that worth it? You know?
Yeah, for sure.
And then,
and again, this all comes back into the broader bracket of ultimately, if you do that X times, do you win the game on whatever turn you're planning to win the game? And can you accommodate slowing other people down in the process?
Right. So
all those discussions only matter once you've already decided what the deck should be doing.
Right. And can I do it consistently? You know, exactly. Like going back to your highest proposition of A, you know, do I have the consistency there to be able to do this X number of times? So this is the point at which Conrad Midrange became Conrad Control, because I had to buy more time in the beginning to get to the later part of the game to be able to do those little pieces along the way. So that's
did your interaction package change? Did it grow? Or what did you look to do to the list?
It was in the beginning, it was lightly focused on spotted removal, like spotted targeted removal, like I'm some
single target removal.
Yeah, single target removal.
Strike removal.
And then as we got, ironically, we got 2 more edict type creatures. There was a heavy edict package added to that. Of course, I mean, the value proposition on, you know, casting a spell and getting 4 triggers for 4 or less mana is, I mean, pretty good. So between that, board wipes, there's a lot more creatures now that have reanimation or recursion effects printed on them. So as they die, you get a trigger. As you exile them to get a recursion effect, they trigger, and then the next creature triggers that it targets, and then, you know, you play that. So now you've got this tighter loop of effects that seek to ping and all of that. But
you found that the card quality had grown enough by the time you revisited the list that you were able to adjust the game plan without significantly hurting what you were doing before.
Exactly, the card quality had improved, but the timing. So the efficacy had improved, but the efficiency wasn't necessarily there, which added increased time.
Understood. Okay,
which is why it became
so
more.
There were more cards that were worth your time, but then as a result, in order to justify using them, you needed to buy yourself more time. That makes sense. Yeah. Adam, you've been quiet for ages because we've not given you an opportunity to speak.
We've been talking over you. We're bastards. Go for it, buddy.
No, you're good. You're good. This is all interesting stuff. I do need you to give me the original question, though.
Well, talk to me about, so when you look at a deck like Conrad, because both of those decks, it's funny, because both those are 2 control decks, self-described control decks, that don't have access to some kind of either significant card advantage quality in the list. Or in the case of Conrad, you have the plunders and stuff, but it's questionable whether or not that constitutes raw card advantage and multiples for you, etc. But in this Mystic Enforcer, you really don't have anything. Right? You're trying to use your graveyard as a toolbox to pull things out, but you don't have strict card advantage. And typically control decks do want to refill their hands once at a time to be able to keep control on the board. So I'm asking both of you, but specifically Adam, because you haven't had a chance to speak for a while, what do you see the role of resource acquisition inside control decks, and by extension for the more defensive or slower mid-range decks?
It's crucial. You have to have access to the cards that you need.
Yeah.
And that's with any of the archetypes. But and Yeah, I mean, from the math that I did in one of the previous articles I wrote, I think it was a 95% of games end in the late game. So, and that's across all archetypes. The only one that tends to beat it is combo. Tends to
So the late game is what by your definition?
seven and beyond.
Okay.
So after turn 7, and so and that's where you get to see these. According to the stages theory, you get to see these things unfold and progress. And sometimes combo gets under that in the mid game, but almost always, I mean, you get your onesie two that'll get on like turn 2. Like those are legendary moments that are few and far between, but have happened.
Do you feel that because your deck doesn't rip through the deck finding more pieces of interaction, you find there's a greater burden on you to be political with the interaction you have available?
I think every deck that this is I'm getting to the answer saying that it forces everybody to survive to the late game, because that's what the pieces that we have to play with in this format are: how do I stop them mid game so I am ahead, or how do I stop them, or how do I get that extra turn to outlast them? And
Sure.
and a lot of mid-range and control and aggro strategies tend to blend and ebb and flow a little bit in this format, because most of the wins happen in late game. And so it's just how you approach and get to late game and win in late game is how you're going to have the greatest odds of winning, regardless of who the opponent is. So I really talk about how you survive to the late game, and every bit of negotiation and every tactic of negotiation, whether it's damage, whether it's reverse damage in the form of life gain, whether it's removing threats, whatever it is. And to your question about Mystic Enforcer, I get rid of the faff with mill, and about every mill card that's in the deck gets me a card in my hand.
So you're looking to effectively sculpt your hand. So although you're not replacing your hand, the sculpting in itself sets up the win condition, which is just beating people to death as a big dummy. And then you're gradually acquiring 2 or 3 pieces of interaction that you can use when absolutely essential, just to buy you 1 extra turn to try and close the game.
So mill, the only thing, and this is where green gets a really bad rap, because it's an unconventional form of draw. But if you draw a card, you might not like it.
Sure.
I get what I like for 2 mana.
Because you're filtering.
So it's the card selection aspect that you think is most important. So you'd rather have a small number of high quality cards rather than a group full of potentially useless cards.
It's impulse draw. No, that's not the right word. It's the card impulse to draw, not impulse draw.
Understood. Reckless impulse type effects. Yeah.
And so it would be like the card impulse, except it goes into the yard, which again, part of the calculus of why Mystic Enforcer. That card likes things in the yard, and what does green and white do best? Recur things, especially white. Recur things out of the yard. It's the best reanimation color in the format, and it's weird to say that.
Unless you care about instances of sorceries, in which case we all know which the best color is. But yeah.
Right. Unless it's instant and sorcery. So anyway, I'm taking a lot of time, but
you're not taking any time at all. You're absolutely fine. I'm conscious, Clay, that are we wrapping up, or how do you feel?
We're at 108.
I would just call it there if you like. Obviously, this conversation could go on forever, but I think we've left ourselves plenty of room to move into deck techs, etc.
Yeah, I think this is a great opportunity now. In fairness to you guys out there, we haven't really talked about. I have announced that I was going to do some sort of like pointed theory relative to a deck thing, but I think Ben and Adam actually have more room to explore this topic if they choose to. Definitely.
So you want to do both?
Yeah.
More yapping the better.
Well, I mean, I think we can all agree that the concept of mid-range, whether or not we agree with the archetype labeling or not, the concept of mid-range and its application relative to performance, there's a problem. And maybe there's air quotes. I know we're presenting a whole lot of information either via slides or what have you.
The Messiah has arrived.
But I mean, maybe
save you, your shitty deck.
Maybe. Well, I mean, quite simply, it's not my intention. I know Ben's making fun. It's not my intention to tell players how to play. However, I think there's a great opportunity for us to synthesize and catalyze some of these like broader concepts down to some simple plans of action that if you want to engage in this and building and playing and winning at this archetype, I think definitely there's some tools that we can provide that are helpful. I don't doubt that in the least.
If we're wrong, we learn from it, right? We move on. Being wrong is as informative as being right on this point. So.
I don't care about being wrong. I'm wrong all the time.
No.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, look, this was awesome. It's been a lot of fun recording the last couple of sessions, having Clay feature. We are looking to do more stuff collaboratively with Clay going forwards. But for now, I've been South. You have been man at the top.
Clay. Woo!
Either one of you, Clay, and then the other guy is
Adam.
Adam Beachpod. God, Mystican Force extraordinaire.
So this over here is Ben. This one over here is
there's somewhere
Adam,
back there.
this
Somewhere is
guy
my
here
ex-wife who won't leave. All right, boys. Well, look, it's been a lot of fun, and hope to catch you in the next one.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
It's
boys.
been real.